In the previous video, the 2nd Battalion of the 134th in the Entertainment District had been viciously shelled by the A300 Battalion, firing the longest range artillery system in the world, being the A300 300mm rocket artillery system, as it had been firing to support the battles going on in Oklahoma City, Dallas-Fort Worth, Shepherd Air Base, and in Fort Sill, as they could fire at a wide range of targets with these very, very advanced 300mm rocket projectors. And they laid complete and utter waste to the Entertainment District directly south of downtown, along with 152mm shells fired from the 40 howitzers, the Type 83 self-propelled howitzers of the 17th Combined Arms Brigade's Artillery Battalion, before they again had shifted their fire in support of their own headquarters elements and Air Defense Artillery Battalion, capturing the lightly defended Will Rogers International Airport from elements of the 2nd Battalion of the 290th, a 290th Infantry Regiment, a reserve force, or a reserve battalion that had been split between a sewage treatment facility in the Mustang area and also the Will Rogers International Airport. As the fighting was raging, beginning officially at about 3 a.m. with the initial skirmishes, as elements of the 2nd of the 134th that had gone underground into the sewers, maintenance tunnels, and deep basements of the city in this area had emerged to find that Chi-Com troops of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion sent into the area from the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade that was sweeping the south-central zones of the city after having conducted flank clearing operations adjacent to I-35 to the west before arriving into the area to clean up what remained of their unit after the savage barrage of not just 300mm rocket strikes and 152mm howitzer strikes in humongous volleys of 40 at a time, as 4 a minute could be fired at a time, although the howitzers didn't always do it like that, as they did not want to wear out their bores. However, ample shells still rained down on this part of the city from the Artillery Battalion of the 17th Combined Arms Brigade in support of the mechanized infantry forces moving into the area. There were also special operations troops that had by this time been ferried from their last battle with American militia forces, a company at a time, by the Transportation Helicopter Battalion, flying their Z-20 transportation helicopters, dropping them off where they secured a landing zone, or an LZ, as well as allowing further companies flying in to begin fanning out, with one company moving to the river to establish control over the bridges across the river, as the operational planning had called for this, just in case any of the local American units, including the 2nd of the 134th, had any type of plans to destroy these bridges to slow down progress. Hence, they seized the bridge, one company, while another company moved slightly to the west and another company moved slightly to the east, while the final company was landing in the area near their key objective of capturing the local political leadership, an area that was actually off limits to artillery, mortars, and airstrikes or strategic air raids, as these individuals were wanted alive. The Mechanized Infantry Battalion that had been conducting their mop-up operations against the remains of the 2nd of the 134th in savage urban combat had split up their battalion in half, with 3 mechanized infantry companies and the fire support company remaining in this area to conduct this operation against the 2nd of the 134th, the mop-up operation, which was a classic textbook hammer and anvil maneuver between the 3 mechanized infantry companies moving into the area, while the other 3 mechanized infantry companies with the headquarters company, which was its logistical support and command elements, had moved in across the bridge, moving a full kilometer between the entertainment district and the downtown area where the city hall was, moving just north of Interstate 40, as they prepared to conduct supporting operations with the Special Operations Company, the last one to be dropped into this area right here. As they, upon conducting this, would begin to fan out and begin to conduct a cordon around the remains of the 1st of the 160th, which by now was only just the cannoneers and individual troops without their howitzers and FASBs, or their field artillery supply vehicles, and their FDC tracks and their supporting vehicles, such as their armored recovery vehicle, their fuel truck, their LMTVs, and MRAPs. As this operation was being conducted approximately 15 minutes after 3, with the last company's landing, the 1st Mechanized Infantry Company had moved into the area, as these mechanized infantry troops were very adept at their operations and had been conducting not just standard military training and maneuver warfare, but they had also been practicing urban warfare intensively for being able to conduct this operation. And although when fighting in rubble in the previous battle, with the remains of the 2nd of the 134th having taken a grand total of 7 KIA, considering the circumstances of having to move through areas where there were literal gas fires erupting and smoldering ruins that masked some of the ISR assets from being able to adequately see everything exactly as it was through infrared, they still managed to wipe out the remains of these forces with relative ease, as, again, the Americans had no ISR assets because they had lost all their satellites and all their internet-based everything, including the grid. As it was hackable, it was connected to the internet. And the electronic warfare jamming had jammed all their redundant systems, including their radios. And they, therefore, were without any actionable intel on where the enemy was at any given moment in time, unless they could conduct certain types of well-prepared ambushes where they had been perfectly still for a time and were relatively fortunate to be well camouflaged by smoldering ruins or a nearby natural gas fire that had broken out amid the rubble that had been destroyed buildings from the rocket and howitzer and even DF-21A strikes that had gotten direct hits on the hotels that most of the troops had actually been in at the time when the invasion had kicked off. The vehicles of the 2nd of the 134th had also likewise been destroyed, as they had been parked in lots, in urban parking lots that had been rented out for the sole purpose of storing their vehicles before they were to be deployed to the OG&E plants for Shore of the Frontier, but it was being discussed if they should deploy troops of theirs to the OG&E Mustang plant, but they would never get the chance, as the invasion had kicked off, before they had the opportunity to remove themselves from the area and deploy to their positions, so to speak. As we go to this map, the previous map, as there were 2 container-based YJ-18C cruise missiles flying over the area, they continued over the kilometer that separated this map and were off this map, flying to hit other targets of importance to the operation. As the first moves in this particular map were the 1st Mechanized Infantry Company that had already been ahead of these 2 companies, beginning vehicles of this one here, headquarters platoon vehicles, combat platoon, combat platoon, combat platoon. And the 1st company to arrive had come up this street, moved around this area, and surrounded the entire city hall. And as they did that, other vehicles had come through here before their headquarters set up and had moved in facing the city hall from surrounding it, while the outer vehicles of these 2 platoons, one platoon around the building, while the other 2 platoons served as a protective cordon for these inner forces. there was already a single platoon entering this building before even these mechanized infantry troops had dismounted to join them, as this building had actually been heavily fortified according to ISR assets and their discovery from the orbiting WZ-8 high-altitude stealth drones flying over the entire metro area, having had seen ample activity as local paramilitary forces in the form of first responders or police and sheriffs had been moving in to try to protect this building with the local city hall security forces and even a few soldiers from further north from the 1st of the 160th who had fled the area and actually ran south and had joined up with these forces as well as armed reactionary civilians. And there were about 2 different squads of these troops, as the confusion had completely reigned in the north with the 1st of the 160th, and the heavy counter battery fire against them had completely and utterly broken them as a fighting force, as a unit, and had scattered their troops underground, similar to what had occurred with the 2nd of the 134th, and to other parts of the city, such as just into this area to the south, where they had taken refuge within this building right here, while others were trying to flee down the street. There were approximately 16 of these troops in total, all scattered and amid these forces of armed reactionary civilians and local paramilitary. By the time the last company of the Special Operations Forces had landed with their Z-20 helos, dropping them off on the rooftop of this hospital building, on the rooftop of this office building, this medical office, as well as in this park right here, with one of the squads dropped off in their diamond formation, pulling security around the helo, dropped off, running to the end of the park to establish a line formation to protect the LZ, just in case there were any casualties, and for later, when they had captured their high-value individuals, to call in the helos to fly them out, as that was the operation. There were one company of special operators to the direct west of this 1 by 1 kilometer map. There was another company to the direct east of this 1 by 1 kilometer map, all having moved up from the LZ to box in this area so far on 3 sides, with a third company to the south of special operators who had secured the bridge, along with FPV drone sections from the FPV drone platoon from the Heavy Special Weapons Company that were highly busy during this operation and were within the kilometer that separated this map from this map, and were flying FPV drones in support of these operations occurring with the high-value capture mission, as well as supporting the troops across the river to the south in their operations in the rubble, clearing all these rubble piles. With this operation beginning officially at 3, but really kicking into high gear at 3:30, where this map begins, and ending just before 6 a.m., while this map, although it started 15 minutes after this map, would end much sooner than the previous map, as in this battle segment of the much larger battle occurring within this 1 by 1 kilometer area, special operations troops would take to the streets and go building to building, clearing all of them methodically of any armed reactionary civilians, American paramilitary elements, and any of the 16 military troops of the 1st of the 160th who had fled south upon their entire battery, losing all its vehicles completely and being totally and utterly smashed. As you can see, they're moving tactically in a line formation, with the point man facing ahead, scanning his sectors of fire. The next guy facing left, scanning his sectors of fire, returning fire against this American who was spotted by their ISR asset, their drone operated by the squad leader, who's further back. And this guy facing to the right, while this guy was facing left and facing ahead. This guy's facing left as well, as it's staggered. You got a guy facing front, scanning this way. You got a guy facing left, scanning this way. You got the guy on the right, scanning this way. You got the guy on the left, scanning this way. And then there's another guy scanning to the right this way, who you can partially see. And then there's a guy behind the guy that's behind him throwing a hand grenade into this building. This guy tried to attack with a pistol, but he was brutally cut down as he was spotted well before he even had the opportunity to by the quadcopter reconnaissance asset hovering high above the area and now dipping low to scan the different buildings, looking through the windows and whatnot. This battle here, as these helos had dropped off these special operations troops, was now in high gear along with the mechanized infantry troops bringing in their heavy equipment, such as their Type 89A armor personnel carriers with their 12.7 millimeter machine gun turrets, their W85 machine guns. These troops armed with light machine guns like the QBJ-201s. They're armed with their QBZ-95 rifles, as so, and also armed with HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, and even the Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, which are stored in big numbers inside of these armor personnel carriers, and their VN-20 infantry fighting vehicle, which is very cutting edge. Even though the ZBD-04 was an outstanding infantry fighting vehicle and is still top of the line, the VN-20 is even a step up from that, incorporating many of the same technologies and with some additional features and even more armored protection than even the ZBD-04 possessed, which is a massive upgrade because the ZBD-04 was built like a rock. As the mechanized infantry forces, again, had surrounded the area and their headquarters platoon had moved in, they had established themselves around this parking garage, sending in headquarters troops to clear the parking garage with one squad of headquarters troops, essentially support troops, moving up to the top of the parking garage to watch this alleyway right here and this street right here behind the operation that's unfolding here, while the MRAP turret gunners are watching this street, this way and this way, along with their armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, watching outside of the perimeter, while the inner perimeter is around the city hall, with special operators moving in to secure the flanks even more, as they are elite troops and are assisting in the capture operation, as there's a full platoon of them from the other regular company of operators just off this map and to the direct west that had sent a platoon into the area even before these mechanized infantry soldiers had rolled into the area to set up a security perimeter around the building. As these other special operators from the other company that had just recently been flown in, besides this platoon securing the area, with this squad in the diamond formation now moving in a staggered column to a line formation spreading out along the end of the park to secure the LZ again in case they need medivacs so they can fly into a secure LZ, or to pick up prisoners like the high-value individuals being captured. While these three squads freshly dropped off, as you can see all the helos are leaving, going the same direction as they all drop off their squads who come out of each end at each door and form a diamond around them tactically to guard the landing zone. They all fly off and leave the area, and these helos will be extremely busy with medivacs just to the south as they literally leave the area. They're now flying just a kilometer away to the entertainment district to pick up the first PLA casualties. There were several wounded during the fighting just to the south, and although there were only 3 wounded WIAs, there were 7 KIAs, which they also picked up and flew back to their CCP property installation, where they were operating out of. As that occurred, and these 4 squads here, besides their 5th one spreading out here, began to move into the area, backed up by their armor personnel carriers of the mechanized infantry troops operating in the area. They now are moving into position with one squad going here, facing this way, before spreading out, breaking up into 2 half squads, with 5 going this way and spreading out, and 5 going this way and spreading out, to guard this entire area, laying down in the prone position in a line formation. And they're sending out their ISR assets to watch the roads and everything, because they also have friendly troops literally off the map adjacent to them as well, also pulling perimeter security in their zone. As after this operation concludes, the next phase of the operation is for the mechanized infantry companies moving up through this map that were part of the group of 3 mech infantry companies, including this one that secured the city hall, moving up into the area, moving north to pursue and destroy the remnants of the 1st of the 160th. There's some paramilitary regime troops up here, as in alphabet troops, and there's some reactionary armed civilians, and what they're going to do is they're going to begin to form a cordon. They're going to go around and cordon this area, these companies. They'll be spread thin at first, but when the special operators have completed this mission, and their other companies to the south had completed their operation by about 6, they would be leapfrogging up ahead and going up to the north and forming that cordon as the others were beginning to go around and form the side cordons, with the special operators helping them in this operation, including those other companies of special operators that completed the capture operation over here, forming the east-facing cordon, or the western cordon if you're the encircled. As all of these operations were occurring at roughly the same time, and although they lasted different amounts of time, they often overlapped, but they were extremely well choreographed, and many operations were successfully carried out with a high degree of precision that had never before been imagined. The door gunners of these helos had greased these guys as they landed. This group of 8 armed reactionary civilians had been seen before these helos even landed and greased them. That was literally the first action that occurred on this map, along with this company having had surrounded this area on the outside and on the inside with their troops, beginning to dismount in rolling T formations as they were looking up to the higher floors, with the end point men and middle point men looking straight ahead. This is the last squad of special operations troops of that special operations platoon to make it into the building. And these dismounted mechanized infantry troops are about to go inside and support them, because by now a massive firefight has broken out inside that building, as the forces inside are literally contesting every hallway and every office and every chamber of this building right here. The inside of it is rife with violence as the firefights become highly intense and pitched battles break out for basically almost every corner of this building, with the special operators methodically going through and greasing everybody they find in each room, chamber, closet, and hallway. They begin to look for their high-value individuals, which this operation is occurring relatively quickly, with the platoon that went in here now backed up by a full platoon of dismounted mechanized infantry troops with their vehicles, including their very potent VN-20s, helping to surround and cordon this area well, with their headquarters troops also watching their back at the parking garage. So with these special operations troops having been dropped off on the hospital roof, only 2 squads leave the hospital, with the rest staying on the roof to watch the streets and watch over their own men as they clear all these buildings, including these troops that landed on, or these are the medical offices and this was the hospital. They landed on the hospital. 2 squads leave the hospital, leaving the other 3 of their platoon on the roof, just as was done on the medical office here. And these troops, 2 squads, bolt across the street and begin to clear this apartment building over here on this city block right here. They clear this apartment building, then they clear this apartment building. These clearances are being done in rapid succession. These special operators are professionals. I mean, these guys already have experience from the Syrian civil conflict, many of them do, and the rest have such a high degree of training and motivation and capabilities that they really are very fast operators as they methodically but rapidly go through these buildings, as they only stop when they encounter enemies, and having not encountered any throughout this building, they move through it relatively fast in a matter of minutes before they leave this building and begin to clear this building. As in, this is done before 10 minutes has elapsed. I mean, they go through here quick. It's 2 full squads. One squad each takes a different floor, and by the time they go through it, they're already bolting to the next building and doing it. The same this apartment building is part of this complex right here on this block, and they're set up the same way, so they're going through them methodically, clearing them, while these 2 squads that left this medical office are clearing this building. So by the time these squads go in here and join them, this building's already clear. And now you have 4 squads from 2 different platoons of this operator company moving through this building here. Now this is a business right here, and they're clearing it, going through it relatively quickly. And as they do that, they split up again. The 2 squads of the platoon that landed on the hospital move into this building to clear it, while the other squads move into this building behind the parking garage as the headquarters troops held their position here just to pull security. So these guys cleared the building, and then after they clear this building, and they already cleared this building together, these 4, and the other 2 squads moved to clear this building. As they are clearing this building on the end of this block, which is this one's a small business, they then leave this area, kick in the door to this building, and then they kick in the door to this building, and then one squad goes out the back door and clears this building while the other squad's clearing this building, and then they split up. And then one squad crosses the street while this squad crosses the street here. As all of these things are going on relatively quickly, the firefight is still going on inside of here, and it's very intense. And as the robotics troops are busy elsewhere, as they have other enemies to contend with to the north, including the company that's deployed to the west of this area that left the LZ and took territory to the west, and the other company that's holding positions to the east, and the company holding positions to the south where the FPV drone operators are, and the mortar teams, they're busy lobbing mortars over this area because mortars are off limits here, and they're hitting the remains of enemy forces that are further to the north in this pocket that their ISR assets are finding, the quadcopter assets. It's all the different quadcopters are like a constellation at the squad and platoon level. They all work together to map the battlefield, even with the high altitude drones. All of them are working together, feeding all the data into an AI data processing system that literally processes multiple dimensions of data and literally does it by the millisecond and can basically calculate in every second exactly what's going on and feed real-time data to commanders in the field and commanders at the strategic level, like generals, and the intelligence analysts as well, to analyze intel to formulate specific battle plans. And they get advice from this AI data system as well on how best to deploy their troops and resources and assets in the field. And it usually almost exclusively gives them perfect results. Now, all of these flank clearance operations are occurring on the flanks of this operational area right here, as the squad here takes position in a line formation, spreading its troops out to guard this street right here, as this mechanized infantry company from these 2 further south, now moving into the area, having come up from a different street in the kilometer that was to the south of this area, while this other one is moving up here, and the vehicles are moving in staggered platoon formations, as so, headquarters in the very back. As they move north, they begin taking fire from hostile forces, but the very powerful turret machine guns of the mechanized infantry forces and the extremely powerful VN-20s 30mm autocannon, 100mm main cannon, and 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax are more than enough to deal with any threats, as these platoons are being led by their infantry fighting vehicles, which are essentially their platoon's command vehicles, and they're extremely devastating on enemy forces. Same is the case over here. As they move north, they begin taking fire from hostile forces. And by the time these three special operations squads reach this point together, now they start taking fire, so now they'll have to bound and cover tactically. They didn't really have to do as much before. They could take longer bounds together before, but now that they're beginning to take contact from enemy forces moving down this street and moving out of this building, and there's two on the roof here, and there's two on the roof here, an FPV drone from one of the 4 FPV drone sections that are operating to the south had moved into this area and completely wiped these guys out on the roof, which aided these guys on the ground immensely. These guys were also destroyed by FPV drones, as they were wiped out early on, right before these forces even got into position. These guys were wiped out by FPV drones sent in by the FPV drone sections. As FPV drones are in extremely high demand, as there's so many targets, as this is a target-rich environment, and there's only 4 FPV drone sections operating in the western pocket area, with the other 1 section helping with operations in the east. There are too many targets for the number of drones that can be operated at one time, which means that the FPV drone operators have to be very cautious with their resources. And again, the AI plays a big role with this, as the FPV drone operators can get high priority to low priority target data, and this helps them with their targeting, as the ISR assets map the battlefield in real time, exactly where enemies are at any given time, and exactly what capabilities the enemies possess, what kind of enemies. That is how the AI helps them pick their targets. And then they send the drones in turn to wipe out the targets, including these guys on the roof, as they could have been a nuisance with Molotov cocktails or other types of weapons that they could have had in this instance, as there were military weapons, as there were some military troops that entered this area. Even though it was only 16, they were still here, and some of them had military-grade weapons. Now, as these guys begin to return fire, they wipe out these guys running out the door here before bounding and covering tactically. This guy bounds ahead first, or actually these two bound first, then this guy bounds a little bit ahead, and they're still taking fire because there's people coming down the street here. And these vehicles, by this point, are taking fire as well from these personnel that were on the roof, and they're firing up at them, and they completely wipe them out with their heavy machine gun. And they're also cutting these guys down with their heavy machine gun, along with these guys opening fire at them with their small arms, also 35 millimeter barrel-fired grenades from beneath their rifles, and Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade anti-personnel rounds, which are nearly ubiquitous, as there were so many of these produced. They were all throughout the vehicles and equipped many of the men of the PLA, and they were easy to access for them. They were there when they needed them. So then, as that occurs, the bounding and covering continues, with this squad bounding off to the left, as they're no longer taking fire by this point, as all of these enemies had been KIA'd from the FPV drone, their own small arms as they're moving through this area, and also the vehicle-based fire from the mechanized infantry troops firing their heavy machine guns, and also the VN-20s firing their even more powerful 30mm autocannons, 100mm main cannons, which are even bigger and more destructive, almost like a tank shell, and they also have their coax machine gun built into them as well. So by the time all of these forces had been completely KIA'd, these two squads continue to bound and cover just to be cautious at this point, as they move a lot more cautiously into the area, before this guy watches the street. As this company by now has already passed the area, as you can see, there's green, they're being engaged further up the street. So these guys watch this corner while these guys bound ahead. Then these guys hold their position here and watch the corner here while they bound ahead. And then they watch the corner, and then they both enter the building together. They kick in the doors. They begin clearing this building with one squad exiting and going into this building here and beginning to take a little bit of fire coming from the north, but then they grease enemies off map, while these guys bound around this way and go in through an entryway here. And then this squad kicks in the door on this building and begins to clear it. And by this point in time, an FPV drone has KIA'd some enemy personnel running down this street here, as well as vehicle-based fire, as again, these enemy forces fired at them, but they returned fire as they tried to move down the street, and they were wiped out by the combo of FPV drone and vehicle-based fire from heavy machine guns and 30mm autocannon fire and 100mm main gun fire from one of the VN-20s in this particular area. This one right here is a VN-20, and the rest are the platoon's Type 89A armor personnel carriers with the heavy machine guns. By the time these squads bound across the street and begin to clear this building and then move to this building, by this point, this company's already moved through the area, and the squads that cleared this area, with one going into this building as shown earlier, there's another squad, two squads that went into this building, now moving into this area. You have a squad from here that finished clearing this area, moving into here. You have a squad moving into here with the other squad covering the alleyway. As they're closing in on this building, they know there's Americans in there, including a few military personnel inside of this building, and they're preparing to storm it as these different special operations squads are now closing in on it, and they're preparing to launch a full-scale assault by throwing grenades through the windows, firing their rocket-propelled grenades, their small arms, 35mm tube-fired grenades beneath some of their QBZ-95s or QBZ-03s, depending on what they're carrying, as they have their own special pick of weapons as special operators, and also HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, as some of the personnel do carry those. They're very destructive. It's a wire-guided anti-tank missile that's extremely destructive. It would annihilate a house and destroy larger buildings, gut them completely, blast portions of them out, in other words. As this squad went and cleared this building in the corner here, they then move out and break into two half squads, 5 apiece, watching this corner and watching this corner, to hold security on this corner as they're watching this way and this way, while these squads over here that cleared this building and now came out and cleared this building with the other peeling out, turning the corner and holding their position before they come out, and then they begin to bound and cover together towards this building, and they're opening fire on it this whole time while this squad's holding this alleyway to prevent escape through this alley. To come out of this alley would mean certain destruction, as these vehicles are right here. So this is all tactically coming together extremely well. So now, as this squad went in and cleared this, the other squad went in and cleared it with them. This squad's holding and securing the corner, and these two are bounding and covering towards this now highly isolated building that's completely cut off by vehicle. It's cut off by troops watching these streets. It's cut off by troops in the alleyway, preventing escape this way or this way. This building's totally cut off. And now it's being raided by these two squads, tactically bounding and covering, who break in through windows and through a door, and now begin to clear this building that has about 30 different enemy forces in it, ranging from reactionary armed civilians to some of the military men that ran south and basically banded together with armed reactionary civilians and some of the local paramilitary elements, like the local first responders and such. And they were all holed up in that building that was now being raided in the same way that the City Hall was being raided itself, with not only one full platoon of special operators going through it thoroughly and completely slaughtering everybody they're encountering in intense firefights, because these guys are trying to fight back, and they're trying to fight back hard, with the backing of the dismounted infantry platoon of mechanized infantry troops. These special operators now have a sheer numerical advantage as these dismounted mechanized infantry troops, along with the special forces troops, are now basically about to achieve their objective, as these special forces now find the hiding spot in the basement of the building, where there were old passages from when the building had been constructed many decades ago, and these special operators raiding the basement of the special operator platoon, while the dismounted mechanized infantry platoon that raided the building with them, that came in after them, they're holding the first floor of the building while these guys are raiding the basement and doing it methodically. And they finally capture their high-value individuals that are on the Chinese deck of cards, just like the Americans had the deck of cards for Iraqi regime members. Well, every state in America, due to its vast size, had a deck of cards in the Chinese invasion. So every state had its own high-value individuals that needed to be captured. And they captured the mayor, and they captured all of the high-ranking local authorities that were now holed up in this building with their security assets fighting back, but they were all brutally put down by the mechanized infantry forces that executed a flawless cordon of this building, as well as the special operators who conducted room raids through their expert building clearance tactics, and basically went through this building like a hot knife through butter. It did take some time, again, because the Americans fought back fanatically. They literally were fighting for their lives, and they knew it. So they put up a good fight. They wounded one of the mechanized infantry dismounts that entered the building, but that's all they managed to do, because the troops that raided the building had heavier weapons than they did. They had grenades, they had anti-tank missiles, although they didn't use those, but they had light anti-vehicle weapons like rocket-propelled grenade anti-tank rounds, which were for the Type 69s, and they also had the anti-personnel rounds for the Type 69, which they did use inside this building, along with some 35mm tube-fired grenades from beneath some of the QBZ-95s that equipped these dismounted troops. And there were also hand grenades used. It was a brutal putting down of these forces, but they fired everything they had in response, whether it was AR-15s that they had been issued, whether it was shotguns, pistols, everything they had they tried to fight back with, but they were brutally crushed. And although they lasted about 1 hour, the fighting had ended with a resounding successful operation for the PLA. And they, the special operators, had escorted, now that the entire area here had been secured, just as had been done to the immediate west and the immediate east by the other companies, had now escorted their prisoner to the landing zone and awaited a helo to come in and pick them up to fly them back to the aviation installation on a CCP regime property that was built up over the decades to conceal and hide all of their transport, attack, and armed recon helos, with prefab metal buildings that were large, and barns and many other facilities that camouflaged the true nature of the CCP property for the 58th Aviation Regiment of the PLA's 58th Group Army. They now had the prisoners picked up via helicopter from the east, from the state regime and the state military command, and they also had the local leadership now in their hands. Both had been flown back to the CCP property and were now preparing to be interrogated and placed in a temporary POW camp for their high-value individuals. As the battle raged on, many other occurrences were going on. Now that this mission had been fully achieved, the forces in this particular portion of the map, including also the Special Operations Company to the west directly and directly east of this section, and the company operating in this section that had secured it by basically encircling and clearing all of it with the mechanized infantry company that stayed in this area, prepared to follow now behind the other two mechanized infantry companies that were beginning to form the cordons of this pocket right here that had been heavily shelled just north and off this map. As the other mechanized infantry companies and the fire support company, already firing Their PLL-05 heavy assault gun mortars, which is a dual-purpose weapon. It could be fired directly into a target like an assault gun, or it could be fired like a mortar with a 5.5-mile range, more than enough to reach 1 mile, 1 kilometer, and another kilometer, which is essentially just over 2 miles, to hit the targets they were firing at, which was the American alphabet paramilitary elements, the remaining troops of the 1st of the 160th, some of which were emerging from underground, similar to the 2nd of the 134th, and reactionary armed civilian bands, making their presence known in this area. And some had already moved south into the City Hall area and paid dearly for it. And now they were about to be encircled by special operations troops, mechanized infantry troops, and the artillery and the light artillery from the mechanized infantry's own fire support company was about to rain hard on these troops, as the artillery battalion of the 190th was still continuing to fire in parts of downtown that they had already hit, but they were told to avoid hitting other certain areas, as it was to become the red zone, like the American Green Zone in Baghdad, only this was for colonial operations and exploitation after their victory. It was to become a red zone for the first colonists to come and build up and establish as their headquarters for this region of America, as in Oklahoma. They continued to fire, though, on parts of the city that were not off limits to artillery, air, or other forms of strikes like heavy mortars or 130 millimeter light artillery multiple launch rocket systems, which had a 5-mile range and were now flying over this area and over this area to hit their targets in this pocket that's developing, as special operators fan out, with mechanized infantry companies fanning out, awaiting the last forces to pack up and move across the bridges to assist in closing the loop completely, as the remains, which wasn't very much by this point, perhaps at this point roughly almost 2 companies, like a company and a half, about 170 American troops were still alive of the 1st of the 160th, with approximately 300 paramilitary alphabet SWAT forces with them, and there were approximately now 200 reactionary armed civilians remaining within this pocket. So essentially, a force of roughly 800 men, or close to that, 780 approximately total. And these forces were now about to be cut off and finished off, but this would occur later in the combat, as this battle was a long battle and it was still only in its early stages by this point. And although the fighting down in the entertainment district wouldn't end until 6 a.m., that would still only put it at 5.5 hours into the official battle going on in Oklahoma City. Although the battle really and truly began with the tandem anti-satellite weapon strikes, with the cyber strikes and the booting on of the electronic warfare, the battle itself, as in the contact phase, didn't officially begin until the artillery barrage began and the movement started, which occurred at 12:30, or 30 minutes after the official nationwide invasion kickoff, which was done to put the beginning of the battle closer to when all of the air assets arrived. And although the last JH-7s filled with munitions, as the others had returned to Mexico to rearm during their RTB, there were still 2 JH-7s that had gone back and gotten fuel from the mid-air refuelers before they had to return and refuel and add fuel to their tanks. These aircraft never dropped munitions at the Will Rogers Battle, the 2 JH-7s. They only did strafing operations in that battle, as shown previously during the Will Rogers Battle map. Instead, they would end up being used against armed reactionary civilian forces at the OG&E power plant, which was now being surrounded by heavy, large maneuver forces and a whole armored battalion and 2 mechanized infantry battalions, as that plant was seen as very important to capture and control, as these forces by now had already moved into the area by 4:15 a.m., as they moved at a steady pace, passing the wrapping up battle at Will Rogers, and arrived 15 minutes before that battle came to an end at 4:30. And even though there were different battles occurring at about the same time and some ending at different times, like this drawn-out battle ending at about 6 a.m., close to it, this battle would begin at 4:15 while this one was wrapping up. And another battle was about to start at that time as well, which would be another battle with another major military unit of the 45th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, which was the battle against the 545th Brigade Engineering Battalion. An interesting unit indeed due to its actual composition, as only one of its actual companies was an engineering company, with another being a signals company and another being military intelligence and a headquarters. Although it was comprised, oddly, it was still a fighting force that had some combat potential, as its mechanized engineer company, its combat engineering company rather, was rather well equipped with Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and of course their brigade engineering vehicle itself, which had the capability to fire a rocket-fired line charge of C4, which could be especially devastating. Although there would be massive support from the remaining combat air patrolling JH-7 aircraft, which still armed with mostly their air-to-air munitions, with many having had already dropped their limited air-to-ground munitions, were still patrolling the area after having flown just several dozens of miles to the south to the nearest refueling aircraft to get fuel before the refuelers had to do an RTB to refuel themselves and re-up with their tanks, and were continuing to fly operations in this area with the fuel that they had. As the fuelers were slated to return to the area immediately upon having conducted their RTB and immediately having had fueled up and also refilled their tanks, a process which could take approximately 2 hours, they would be flying back just in time to link up with them to refuel their tanks and be able to make it to their own RTB back in their bases in Mexico as well, allowing for them to continually provide air cover at least until 5 a.m. As the battle occurring at 4:15 against the 545th Brigade Engineering Battalion would consist of the same two mechanized infantry battalions that attacked these reactionary armed civilians with the helos that were trying to establish a refugee camp, as well as the kill box created against the 1st of the 179th, which was a spectacular success and only lasted just about 30 minutes or just under it, before they now prepared to cross the river and attack with armored support